Hi everybody, my name is Mattia Chiappa, I hope you're doing well. With some of my students, I have been talking about writing a march quite a lot, and I thought it would be interesting to give it a go myself. I hope this is going to be a quick and easy one, but before we start talking about how I approach this, let's have a quick listen to this short piece I wrote. So first of all, what is a march? According to Wikipedia, at least, a march is a musical genre, is a piece of music with a strong regular rhythm, which in origin was expressly written for marching to and most frequently performed by a military band. Now, obviously, the piece I've just played is not written for a military band or a marching band, but the orchestration does refer to this type of ensemble by making very heavy use of percussion instruments like snares to carry the rhythm, piatti for accents, but also woodwinds as melodic instruments, and most importantly, brass, which are right on the front, both as melodic instruments and accompaniment for the vast majority of the time. Right from the start, I'm using this main rhythmic pattern, which I will then break sometimes just to let the piece breathe a little, and that will not only be our main rhythmic motor, but it will also serve as an anchor to glue different sections together. In terms of harmony for this introduction, I'm slowly building to this C major chord, stacking parallel fifths every 2 bars, split between different instruments in the lower register of the orchestra. I'm very much referencing to the harmonic language of Americana and Aaron Copland here. I recommend having a listen to the opening of Hold Down if you don't know the piece already, because this piece is a fantastic example on how to use parallel fifths and open strings for the whole string section. Of course, this is not necessarily a march, but I do find these genres to be quite interchangeable somehow, and it works very well for the vibe I'm trying to create here. On top of all this, we have a melodic line harmonized within the woodwind section, and again, as part of the same harmonic language, I'm using the extensions of the chords for my main melodic line. Keeping these things in mind, let's have another listen to the beginning. Right at the end of this section, we have a change of harmony, moving from a B flat major chord to an E major, releasing some of the tension that we have built so far and starting to shift into a more heroic kind of vibe. We have brass holding these two chords while the rest of the orchestra is still playing the rhythm. After this, we're going back to C, and we now have this brass fanfare split between trumpets, horns, and tenor trombones, doubled by percussion. And I think this sounds like a quite interesting interplay of different voices working together to create this heroic vibe. So let's take a quick listen to these parts in isolation. For just a few bars, I also dropped the rhythm that we had up until now, but it then reappears crescendo to the end of the section and the beginning of the real piece. So that was a pretty long introduction, but hopefully it's gonna come in handy the further we progress into the piece. Now, let's get into the more interesting stuff. What I'm gonna play in a few moments is our actual piece. We have two main melodic statements, the first on French horns, doubled by English horn, clarinets and flutes, and the second on trumpets and French horns in 2 octaves. Also, every time I will play this particular rhythm, I will double it on tubular bells, glockenspiel and harp as well. The first couple of bars are played by French horns on their own without any harmonic support, and the whole orchestra joins in with a big stab on this long sustained G. Right after this, the accompaniment goes back to our main rhythm, but at this point is only played by strings and brass, then joined by woodwinds on the second half. Notice how, when moving between these two different variations, the harmony shifts from a suspended chords over a C pedal tone to a much clearer chord progression on the second half. I use this particular trick all the time, and generally speaking, I will very rarely repeat the very same thing exactly the same way twice, because I want to keep it interesting for the listener, hopefully. And this is particularly important when we are dealing with such simple music like we do here. Moving on to the next section, there isn't anything that we haven't already heard so far. It's just basically a reiteration of the introduction, but now in a more condensed form. And that works as a bridge between old and new. I'll play this in its entirety, but I don't want to focus on it too much because we have already talked about this. The following part can be considered as the B theme of the piece, and I will play the piano-reduced version of it in just a second. But I first want to point your attention to what is about to happen here. Do you remember how, a few moments ago, I've talked about reharmonizing the second pass of our melody in a different way? Now, see if you can spot the similarities between this and what I did for the A section. Basically, the first half consisted of suspended chords over a C pedal tone, and again, the real chord progression only comes in on the second pass. So it's exactly the same trick I've used for the A theme. Talking about the orchestration, we start with very few elements. We have our main melody on violins, then followed by violins again, but later into octaves, doubled by oboe. And for the accompaniment, we drop for the very first time our main rhythmic cell, replaced now by triplets that we have on French horns, bassoons, clarinets, and harp arpeggiating the chord tones. On the second half, I'm using an entirely different rhythm inspired by very common marching band patterns. And the very same rhythm is also reflected on the rest of the strings, brass, and woodwinds on the second half of the bar. Okay, let's now play the B section from the top. After this B section, we are going back to our main A theme, played by trumpets and slightly unusual doublings, with glockenspiel and piccolo playing the very same melody 2 octaves higher. While in the background we have some big stabs split within the whole orchestra. Just like before, I wasn't going to just copy and paste this whole section, so we have again some subtle changes in harmony for the first half, leaving major changes for the second. For this part, I'm also modulating a whole step up to the key of D, and I'm using this descending bass line as my main driving motor. Many marches use this particular device, and I'm basically trying to use this cliché in order to stay true to the style. And for the rest of the accompaniment, we have some ascending runs on violins and high woods. And of course, the melody is taken again by trumpets and French horns, doubled by violas, tremolos, English horn, and oboes. Let's take a listen. The following few bars are slowly setting up the build for the big fanfare coming right after this. We have a few different stuff going on, including calls and answers and variations of the melody in different keys, going from woodwinds to strings, strings to woodwinds, then trumpets, and back to strings and woodwinds together. Do you remember the rhythmic cell we had at the start? I haven't entirely given up on it yet, and I'm actually starting to reintroduce it here. I will now play this section and the following fanfare so that you can have some context on how these two sections are flowing into each other. The fanfare you just heard is exactly the same that we had as part of the introduction, but guess what? It's now repackaged differently to make it sound as new, fresh material. And I think you might be starting to get an idea of my thought process here, which basically consists in very simply insisting on the very few ideas I have and repurposing them in a different harmonic context in order to refresh the palette and make them sound new yet familiar. Talking about the orchestration, we have a few different things happening at the same time. Low brass woodwinds and percussion are holding the rhythm, while we have pads on strings. On top of the fanfare, high strings and woodwinds are playing these counter melodies. And we also have the rest of the percussion doubling the fanfare, and harp on an arpeggio that outlines the main melody notes. And finally, the piece ends with some orchestral stabs with tension and resolution in the chord progression. And the orchestration keeps moving down in register, ending with a single low C played on low strings, brass and woods. That's it. I was really looking forward to doing this. I hadn't done anything quite like this in a while, and this type of music inspired by early 90s, mid 80s film scores is just so much fun to write. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please hit the like button and leave a comment and subscribe. And if you enjoy content like this and want to support the channel, feel free to check out my Patreon page. If you're new to the channel and you haven't watched my other videos already, I've made a few other tutorials about orchestration and creating music in general, and they're gonna pop out somewhere on the screen, I think. That being said, thank you very much for watching and see you on the next one. Bye.